Right. We're going to go ahead and get started with the live stream. This is the second in our Candid Candidates series. We're very pleased to be joined by Chris Peterson, who's the Democratic candidate for governor. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, Turner. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be with you today.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you. Before we get started, I'm just going to let those who are watching live know to please submit your questions here on Facebook. If you see me looking back and forth throughout the event, that's because I'm looking at the live stream questions. So please feel free to submit those and we'll be sure to ask Chris those. But to get started, let's go ahead, Chris. Why don't you tell us about yourself, your family, interests, that kind of stuff.
Well, okay, Turner. I always have a hard time knowing where to start on that, but I guess maybe one place to start is, some of my family long term. My great-great-grandfather led a wagon train of 1,500 pioneers to the state of Utah back in 1847. So my family goes back about as far as the sort of settlement of Utah by European folks goes. He was also, by the way, Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he was one of the first public school superintendents in Utah. And he was a chairman of Zions Bank, but I don't know where all the money went because I was raised out in West Valley City. I know that Westview is focused on West Salt Lake. I think of myself as a West Sider, but West Valley City, a little further out in the suburbs. And I grew up in a single parent household. My mom was disabled when I was a kid. And so we had very limited income, struggled to get by, got my first job when I was about 10 or 11 years old, picking up trash on the side of the road on 3500 South. But eventually worked my way through college at the University of Utah and traveled the world, won a scholarship to law school. And somewhere along the way, I decided I wanted to focus on public service and teaching and trying to make the world a better place. And so I guess a little bit about my bio, if that's helpful.
Yeah, and I know that your lieutenant governor candidate isn't here on the call with us, but why don't you share a bit about who you selected as your running mate?
Oh, sure. Yeah. My lieutenant governor running mate is a wonderful person. Her name is Karina Brown, and she's a social activist. I mean, she's done a number of great things. The thing that I'm most excited about, though, was she was one of the original sponsors of the Medicaid expansion ballot measure that passed a couple of years ago. And we really are big advocates of that and some of the other ballot measures, the medical marijuana that's prescribed by a physician, and also the anti-gerrymandering ballot measure. And she also works for a nonprofit, the Children's Justice Center, trying to stop child abuse and abuse of kids, and is on the board of a hospital up there and the Chamber of Commerce advocating for small businesses. She's from Cache County, up near Logan, Utah. And it was important to me to have a little bit of balance on the ticket. Obviously, I'm a guy and I wanted a woman running mate to try to balance the ticket and have some gender diversity. And I'm also from Salt Lake City, but live in Salt Lake City now. But I wanted to make sure that rural Utahns had a say in things too. And she's from a rural area in Cache County. And I felt like that helped balance out the ticket and gives us a competitive 1-2 punch that I think would really be a breath of fresh air for the government.
Yeah, that's interesting. Certainly a unique background. Thank you. So you decided to run for governor. I'm going to ask these questions and they may seem a little bit of a background or a backwards order, but I found it best to ask them in this way. What is the most important role that you think the governor plays?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, for me personally, the most important role in my life in any capacity will be being a good dad. I'm married and have 3 kids, and they come first in my life. But for the governor, and generally speaking, in the abstract, I think it's to make sure that the laws and the programs of the state are implemented fairly and efficiently, and that they're organized in a way that tries to help all Utahns. I think that in recent years, our government, we've had a one-party government at the state level for a long time. And when you have a system like that, whether it's Democrat or Republican, it has a tendency, those kind of governments tend to creep more and more towards special interests and insiders and those who are privileged. You see the same kind of thing happening in Illinois government. Chicago politics is notoriously corrupt because, you know, it's always Democratic there, and the party insiders and the elites get to make a lot of the decisions. We have our own version of that that's been happening here in Utah for a long time. Those ballot measures I just mentioned are a great example. The public voted for all three of those ballot measures, passed them in 2018, and yet the state legislature, with the assistance of the governor's office and the lieutenant governor, came and revised and rewrote those ballot measures and watered all three of them down, weakening them, even though the public just voted for them. So I think that the most important thing right now for the governor is to listen to the public and implement laws and programs in the public interest.
Thank you. So with that importance ahead of you, I guess, what made you decide to run for the position of governor?
Well, you know, I'll be honest, when the Democratic Party came and asked me to do it, I was very surprised. I thought they were going to ask me to give a talk or, you know, make a donation or something. And I initially said, no, find somebody else. And there were some other candidates that stepped forward, but I think, to be candid, probably not people who are maybe ready, in my judgment, to actually successfully be the governor. It's a tough job. There's a lot of different agencies, the state legislature to manage. And if you don't do a good job of it, people can really get hurt. And I decided I was willing to run for governor because, you know, as I've seen what's been happening in our state, it makes me sad that we don't have a government that's looking out for ordinary working people who are struggling to make ends meet. Single moms, like I was raised by out in West Valley City, small businesses who are struggling to get by, all those restaurant servers who are struggling to make ends meet and are facing eviction, and many people who have been doing great and have their own homes but are now looking at foreclosure because our economy is collapsing and we're not getting this virus under control, and we're not doing enough to make sure our public schools are working, and we're all increasingly breathing this toxic air. We have real problems in this state and we're not getting the job done. I'd like to have a chance to try to be a breath of fresh air, move the government in a positive direction, and make a positive difference in the ordinary lives of Utahns all across the state.
Thank you. So you mentioned that you pursued a career in public service and that you went to law school. So are you a practicing lawyer, or can you give me a little bit of background?
Sure. Yeah, I am a practicing lawyer, but right now I'm teaching at the University of Utah. I'm a law professor. That's my day job. Back during the Obama administration, I did work for the federal government in a couple of different ways. I worked at the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Consumer Protection Agency that they created after the financial crash. You know, remember back in 2008, many of the nation's banks collapsed, were insolvent, that were going bankrupt, and millions and millions of Americans were being foreclosed on. So Congress got together and tried to create a new agency to treat people more fairly. And that's what I've done, spent most of my career working on. And so they recruited me to come back and help do that. And I helped set up the office in that agency that would investigate and do law enforcement against big banks, debt collection agencies, payday loan companies, to make sure that they're following the law. And we found a lot of them that were doing a good job, but others that were breaking the law. And for those, we managed to get about $12 billion in refunds and restitution when they broke the law. Usually that was, they said something that wasn't true, or maybe had some disclosures or something that was misleading. And we returned all that money to, and forgiven debts to about 10% of the adult population of America. I'm really proud of my work there. And then after I did that, they also asked me to head over to the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, and do some of the same kind of work for our active duty soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen, to make sure that they weren't being ripped off by payday loan companies and other lenders that were taking advantage of them. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done. It's now illegal to make a payday loan to any Marine anywhere in America. And I'm proud that the Secretary of Defense gave me an award for my efforts. So I've been, represented the Pentagon in negotiations with the White House on how to get the job done for our troops. I believe I have the experience to come back here in Utah and do the same kind of thing, try and get our government going in the direction of taking care of ordinary working people.
Thank you. I find your background in consumer protection absolutely fascinating. And One follow-up question that I have, as you know, payday loans have been a big problem here in the state of Utah. There's been several attempts to address them, to cap them. Is that something that you view as an important role or something that you would focus on as governor?
Well, it's certainly something that's important to me, and I would use every tool in the governor's toolkit to try to protect consumers from payday loans or other kinds of scams, fraud, or abuse. Of course, the governor doesn't get to write the law. The state legislature does that, and then the governor implements it and enforces it. And I'm a law and order guy. I'm going to play by the rules, and so to really make progress, we've got to get the state legislature to go in a different direction. But there are a lot of things that the governor's office could do. We could focus on making sure that to the extent that we do have some consumer protection laws, that those are enforced. And I could use the bully pulpit, the ability to reach out and communicate, to try to forge compromises with the state legislature to improve the laws, to try to protect our citizens. That's definitely something I want to focus on. The Department of Commerce has a division of consumer protection that focuses on not just that, but all sorts of other scams and frauds and things that are out there. And frankly, we've got quite a lot of that in our state. We as Utahns want to be left alone. We don't believe in big government, and we don't believe in regulating things too much. But that doesn't mean that it's okay to go out and lie and cheat people in the marketplace. And I think that we need a little bit more focus on that to try to take care of folks that are maybe getting a bad deal out there, whether that's in their jobs or in their relationships with banks or credit unions or payday loan companies or whoever it might be.
Thank you. And I'll give you a break because I know that I've just peppered you with questions. I'd like to remind those who are watching live to please submit questions in the live chat, and I'll be sure to ask them of Chris. You mentioned the legislature and kind of reorienting the legislature to focus on different priorities. If you're elected, you face likely a 2/3 majority in the legislature. What do you view the governor's role, or how would you accomplish kind of getting the legislature to focus on different priorities?
Well, right now it's a 2/3 majority, but I'm not so sure it's going to be after this election. We've got a lot of great candidates on the Democratic side, and then there's some real swing seats out there that could flip back to the Democratic side. I think it's probably likely there'll still be a Republican majority, but maybe not a Republican supermajority in both houses. And if that's the case, if we have a governor in place that's a Democrat, it really could force Republicans to come to the table, because if the governor vetoes something, then Republicans would have to only be able to override that veto with a 2/3 vote. So that would really give us a seat at the table to make progress in our state on all the different types of legislation that goes through the state legislature. One thing I'll just mention, right now we managed to expand through a ballot measure access to Medicaid. We talked about that just a little bit earlier. But a lot of folks don't realize that the legislature still has the power to rewrite those laws and back out of that deal that the public approved 2 years ago. A lot of folks already wanted to in the state legislature. So come January, when the legislature starts up again in its next general session, it's entirely possible that they'll attempt to undo the Medicaid expansion and kick 100,000, 150,000 Utahns off of their health care again. And one of the things that I can do if I win this election is fight back against that, negotiate, persuade, and do everything I can to make sure that we are expanding access to healthcare, not taking it away.
Thank you. So I know I've kind of taken you off what we were originally talking about, which is the biggest issues and the reason that you decided to run. But I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell me what the biggest issue you hope to tackle is if you're elected.
Well, taking a step back from things, I think that the biggest issue that we're facing right now in Utah state government is that it's just too one-sided. We've had Republican supermajorities and a Republican governor for so long now that I think that some of those folks who maybe good people, it's okay. I'm not disrespecting Republicans. The problem is that we need to have balance and competition in our state government. anytime you have a system that doesn't have checks and balances, it starts to break down and you have corruption. Let me just give an example. After the coronavirus crisis came, when we're all facing this serious disease, we had millions and millions of dollars that were passed on to the state from the federal government in bailout funds. And we started spending that. And a lot of that money went to places that I think actually weren't really in the best public interest. Just one example, they tried to develop a cell phone application to try and track where the virus was. It hired a company that really wasn't prepared to do it. And they did it without any bidding process, just hired some friends of some friends. And of course, the cell phone application doesn't actually work. It's not tracking anybody. And we blew millions of dollars on something that didn't actually do anything. And at the same time, it turned out that there was another company that was providing a better technology and was willing to do it for free, and it had already been approved by Google and Apple to work with their cell phone technology. That's the kind of thing that happens when you have a government that's not balanced and competitive, where there's two sides to every story and you're working together through compromises. If one party has all the power, then it's easier for them to make mistakes and start going down a path that isn't in the best interest of the public, but is in fact in the best interest of special interests, privileged elite party insiders, folks that are, frankly, is it too rude to say kissing up instead of doing a good job? So that's the most important big picture ticket, big picture item I think that we need to change in state government. And I think I'm well positioned to do that. I'm not tied to any industry group. I don't have a bunch of favors I owe to somebody that got me to where I'm at. I'm just a public servant that wants to advocate on behalf of ordinary working families.
Thank you. So to kind of follow up on that, one of the most important roles that you'll have as governor is the appointments of different department heads in your cabinet. So there's a theory that appointments or hiring is policy, if you will. So how will you as governor prioritize appointing diverse communities, folks that maybe don't normally have a seat at the table? This is something that is very important in the communities that we serve here on the West Side. So if you wouldn't mind expanding on that.
Sure, you're right. Hiring great staff, putting them in place to go out and do the business of the public is one of the most important tasks that the job of governor has. And I also add to that, not just administrative officials, but also judges who go out and make decisions on who goes to jail, who goes to prison, and who doesn't. That's also a very important challenge for the governor's office. What I'll say to begin with is that I think that our appointments need to reflect the diversity and cosmopolitan nature of our state. Utah is becoming more and more diverse. And for too long, I think that too many of the top appointments have frankly looked a little too much like me. We need more women in top leadership positions. We need more minorities to have opportunities. And it's not just because we're engaged in, want to engage in some sort of charity. No. Diversity is a strength. When you have more perspectives, it's easier to remove blinders and see problems from a broader, more diverse, and more informed perspective. We will have a stronger, more vibrant government if we have a more diverse government. So my commitment is that I'm going to appoint the most diverse executive branch in the history of the state of Utah. That being said, though, I also am very committed to making sure we have competent people who are qualified to do the job and are going to be there using taxpayer resources wisely and providing services to the Utahns in the way that they all deserve. So that's the general approach that I'll have to trying to get the job done for the public.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on that with a question about the many boards and commissions. The legislature and the governor have identified that we have all these different boards and commissions that exist, and there's a lot of empty seats. And is there a mechanism that you can see or envision where you could help fill those boards and make, I guess, the bureaucracy and these advisory bodies more efficient and effective?
Yeah, I think that that sort of thing is a constant battle, making sure that you're recruiting talented people to work on the boards, but also some of them that aren't being filled. There might be some reasons. It could be that there's some of them maybe don't really aren't as necessary as they once were. Don't want to name any by name, but you know, it's a board that existed, it was started 40 years ago might have been particularly important at that time, but may not be as important today. And that might be part of the reason that some of the jobs aren't being filled, because maybe nobody's that interested in working on the board. But I think generally speaking, we want to keep red tape cut down to a minimum as much as possible. But we also have to recognize that the government has work to do, and we need a good cheerleader, somebody that's going to be in the governor's office, pushing constantly to try to make sure the government works effectively. I think I'm well situated to do that. I've worked in the public sector, and I'm a thoughtful attorney, and I'm an energetic guy that tries to solve problems with teamwork, cooperation, civility, and always in the interest of the public. That's the way I'll approach those kind of boards.
Thank you. And we did get our first audience question. Ashley, if you'll give me just one moment, we're going to transition into the economy, and I'll be sure to ask your question just after this next question. So as governor, one of the roles that people view as most important for the governor is promoting an economy that works for everybody here in the state of Utah. So can you share as much detail as you'd like what your economic priorities or policy would look like and how it is different than our current government?
Sure. Okay. Well, I think that one of the top priorities we've got is to get ourselves through this coronavirus crisis. We've got to get this virus under control. Right now, what's holding our economy back more than anything else is that too many people don't feel safe going out, going to a restaurant, going to the store, going to theaters, doing the kinds of things that normally move an economy forward. And it's putting so many of our small businesses on the edge. And many people are struggling because they've had their hours pulled back at their jobs, or their small businesses just aren't pulling in the revenue that they need. We've got to get our economy back on track. And the first step to doing that is getting the virus under control. So one of the first things that I think that we need to do now, we'll take a look in January if I'm elected, but right now we need a statewide mask mandate. And why do I say that? Well, because we're continuing to have outbreaks of the virus. Just yesterday, we had over 400 new confirmed infections of the coronavirus. That each one of those can spread to another 2, 3, 4, or more people. And one of the most effective, cost-effective, and effective ways that we have to try to slow down this spread is asking people to wear a mask when they're in public. It's not perfect, but it does do a good job of getting under control. Second, we've got to get our coronavirus testing times down faster. Right now, it's taking 2, 3, 5, 7 days to get those tests processed. And in the meantime, people don't know whether or not they are safe to go back to work or to go visit their friends or neighbors or loved ones. And the result is that once that person does find out, in fact, they are infectious, it may be that in order to track down all those other people, the number of people they've been in contact with has grown exponentially. And so we've got to get testing times faster. We also, I think, should ramp up and have many more contact tracers, meaning people who are tracking down, working for our Department of Public Health, identifying who is potentially exposed, and then helping them get to a safe and humane spot to quarantine. So that's step one, getting the coronavirus under control. Step two, I think we need to do some of the same things we have been doing. Generally speaking, we want to keep our taxes low, and we want to keep regulations as modest as we can. But we also need to do a better job of creating incentives to spread the wealth to some of our working families. The Utah economy before the coronavirus crisis was doing pretty well, especially for people up at the top. But people who were maybe had lower income jobs were struggling to get by. Many of them were working 2, 3 jobs, and still barely making ends meet. And I think that we need to, some things we should do is consider raising our minimum wage. We still have a minimum wage in the $7 range. It hasn't been adjusted for decades, and that's not good enough. We should be increasing our minimum wage. We should also be creating tax incentives to retain working employees, and we also should be cooperating and working with organized labor. In countries that have unions, and those unions represent a good portion of the economy, those unions go out and negotiate for better paying jobs, for workplace safety, for healthcare. And in Utah, we've drifted a little too far away from that, I think. So those are some steps that I think that we should be taking to get our economy back on track and making sure that we've got good paying living wage jobs for everybody.
Thank you. So the question that Ashley submitted on the live chat was about Utah's proposed Inland Port Authority. And I'd like to ask you, the Inland Port Authority is being billed as something to help with rural economic development, but it's housed here on the west side. So if you wouldn't mind responding, what are your thoughts on the Utah Inland Port Authority and rural economic development?
Sure. Well, so first off, I have some concerns with the inland port, both in terms of the process, the way that the Inland Port Authority got its authority and is moving forward. And then second, with the substance and how the inland port is going to actually function in the lives of people as out on the west side, but throughout the entire valley. So first, with respect to process, I was disappointed that the state legislature passed the law creating the Inland Port Authority with very little input or feedback from Salt Lake City, which is going to bear the brunt of the infrastructure challenges, the crowding, and also air pollution is a very significant concern with the inland port. That being said, I recognize that we in the state of Utah have a rapidly growing population, and we need good paying jobs. I just said as much a moment ago, and there is the potential for the inland port to bring some jobs to the state of Utah. So I think that we should have given much more local control to Salt Lake City over the inland port. And I think that going forward, we need to do everything that we can to make sure that the inland port is providing not just jobs, but good paying jobs, that it's open to organized labor and unions, and that also we're doing everything we can to decrease the burden from air pollution and adjust the infrastructure so there's not too much overcrowding and traffic that is burdening people out on the west side. So some of the things that we can do to do that, we should require that businesses out there are open to organized labor. We should insist that those businesses that are developing new warehouses and new facilities are investing in solar power to try to offset the increased energy needs, and that they not only they have solar power on their rooftops, but that they've got the batteries there to store that solar power. So it's there when they need it, whether it's the sun is shining or not. And we should also be encouraging and putting pressure on businesses that are doing business at the inland port to quickly transition first initially to Tier 3 gasoline, which is cleaner and creates less fine particulate matter pollution in the valley. But in the medium term, to quickly transition to electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles to decrease the amount of emissions that are coming out of the trucks and cars that are going to be doing business at the inland port. So those are some of the steps that I think that we can take to minimize it. One last thing I'll say, a lot of people want to just repeal the inland port and get rid of it. And I have some sympathy for that view. I recognize that many people were not welcoming that inland port, both out on the west side of Salt Lake, but also on the east side too. I think that we have to be realistic, though, about what is possible. The state legislature has already voted for this and passed a law to create that inland port. It seems to me that it's coming, whether we like it or not. And the key is to make it as safe, minimize air pollution as much as possible, and try to make those jobs good paying jobs that are going to serve our residents well.
Thank you. And just to follow up on the rural economy, and what you would do to kind of tie the rural economy together with more urban areas.
Sure. So on the rural economy, with respect to the inland port, there are a lot of places in Utah that are really looking to try to create job opportunities, and be much more welcoming of the inland port than maybe the west side of Salt Lake is. And I think that I'd be very open to working with the Inland Port Authority to try to find spurs or other places throughout the state to try to get some of those jobs pushed out to an area where the air pollution burden might not be quite as high. Just over the hills in Tooele, there's a lot of open space out there and a lot of people in Tooele that need some jobs. So it's not such a crazy idea to spread some of the wealth out there. I'll also, with respect to rural economic development more generally, a couple of things. First off, I think that we should be developing our clean energy natural resources to create good paying jobs in solar power, wind power, and geothermal energy to try to offset some of the diminished employment that we've seen in the coal industry. And also we've even seen some struggling in the oil and gas industry as well. We can create new commercial clean energy plants and invest more of our technology and more of our taxpayer resources into incentives for those clean energy jobs that are much more likely to put us on the path to a sustainable future and also grow the economy out in rural areas. Also, I think that we should be more open to telecommuting. One of the things that we've learned about the coronavirus crisis is that you can actually get a lot done virtually. And I think that many of our Silicon Slopes businesses are going to be increasingly open to the idea of having rurally based telecommuting jobs going into some of our great technology sector employers. So just a couple items on rural job growth.
Thank you. We did receive another question from Kim. She asked, and I know you answered this at the beginning, but I'd like to give you an opportunity just to respond directly to Kim. She asked what your view is on overriding citizen initiatives.
Hi, Kim. It's one of the biggest reasons I'm running for governor. I do not like that the state legislature and the governor and lieutenant governor tried to undo 3 ballot measures from the last election. The Medicaid expansion ballot measure, they put a bunch of qualifications and contingencies in that, making, delaying the ability of residents that would have otherwise qualified for Medicaid to get that coverage that they were should have been entitled to. And there were also a bunch of red tape and bureaucracy that was put in place to try to slow down medical marijuana, which the public voted for. The public recognized that it's safer than opioids and gives some real relief to people who may be suffering from cancer or epilepsy or other diseases. And then last, we as a state passed a Better Boundaries initiative to try to make sure that gerrymandering doesn't occur after the census that we're taking right now. And I'm just really disappointed that our state legislature decided that they know best about drawing boundaries as opposed to the independent commission that the public voted for. I will protect ballot measures and citizen-led initiatives. It's one of the big challenges we're facing right now because the government is increasingly not listening to the public.
Thank you. I'm going to give you just a break as I remind viewers who are watching live on Facebook to submit your questions here in the chat, and we'll be sure to ask them of Chris. To go back a little bit to what we were talking about before Kim's question, as far as rural economic development goes, you were talking about telecommuting. How would you, one of the key components of telecommuting is having good access to internet and particularly broadband. So as governor, how would you prioritize the deployment of or bridge the digital divide in rural communities?
Yeah, I think that we, just like we invest right now in infrastructure with respect to our roads, our sewer, our water, we need to understand that broadband internet is a critical form of infrastructure for the 21st century. We spend a lot of money in this state building and then rebuilding again our roads. And we've got great roads, and that's something that we could be proud of. But, we don't have such great broadband infrastructure, especially in some rural areas of the state. And I am very open to negotiating, working with the state legislature, working with telecommunications companies to try to bridge that digital divide. My plan will be to work as a team to try to overcome that obstacle and get the job done. We need to make sure that people throughout the state, from north to south, east to west, in Salt Lake City and all the suburbs, have access to fast, efficient, cost-effective internet so we can engage in the commerce of the future.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to a couple of audience questions that have come in as direct messages to me. One is specifically about LGBTQ rights and what you would do as governor to promote them.
Well, I like to consider myself an ally to the LGBTQ plus community. I think that we need to recognize the dignity, the equal dignity of all adult loving relationships. And so I want you to know, my LGBTQ plus friends and neighbors, that I see you and care about you. I'm going to listen to the concerns that you have. Some specific legislative initiatives. We made a little bit of progress back in, I think it was 2016, with a compromise bill that prohibited discrimination in housing and employment. It was a nice step, but I would not say that that goes far enough. We need a more generally applicable public accommodations law that prohibits discrimination in other retail situations as well. And I would add to that specifically, we need to have an anti-discrimination law in finance. If it shouldn't be legal to discriminate against a gay or lesbian couple, for example, simply because if they apply for a home mortgage loan or a credit card. That's the kind of progress that I think we can still make. And I'm open to many other potential options to try to lift up our LGBTQ community.
Thank you. The next question is about tribal sovereignty and how you will work with Utah's many Native American tribes.
Well, I want all the Native American tribes, our indigenous folks, to know that I recognize the sovereignty of all of the tribal governments in the state and will approach negotiations with them as equal partners. The Navajo Nation, the Utah, the Utes, the Shoshone, the Paiutes, all across the state. We need to make sure that they feel like their voices are being heard, and I will listen and try to work in a collegial and respectful manner with the tribal governments.
Thank you. At the beginning of the live stream, you mentioned that you have three kids. So I imagine that education is something that's at front of mind for you. And I'd like to just ask you quickly what your views are on education. And then I'm going to dive into some specifics, but I'd give you the opportunity to speak generally.
All right, well, great. I think it's a super high priority for me. I think it's a shame that a state that has as much potential, as much as many economic resources as we have, still to this day, after many decades, is dead last in per pupil funding for our public school system. We have a lot more resources than New Mexico and Mississippi and many of other states that are doing a better job at funding their schools. Of course, we have a lot of kids in Utah, and we have a young population that creates a challenge. But the simple fact is that we have not done enough to make sure that kids have the resources that they need to learn and to succeed. A terribly sad statistic I'm familiar with is that currently in Utah schools, about 1 in 4 fourth grade children cannot read yet. Now that puts those kids on a difficult track as they get older and go to junior high. It's easier for them to drift away and lose focus on their education, and it makes them less likely to graduate from high school and less likely down the road to get a great paying job where they can build a family and a future for themselves. 1 in 8 kids in our state are not graduating from high school on time. And I'll also add, one of the saddest statistics I'm familiar with about our public education is that we have one of the highest teen suicide rates in America in the state of Utah. One reason for that is that our public schools are spread too thin. We don't have the teachers in place to make sure kids are learning how to read, but we also don't have the guidance counselors there, nurses and mentoring systems in place to spot it when kids are maybe being bullied or not being included. And it's easier for them to drift away and to suffer and perhaps potentially even take their own lives. We've got to invest more in our schools. We need to make sure that the resources are there. And look, I'm a fiscal conservative. I don't want to raise taxes, unlike as much as the next person. But in our public schools, we have cut to the bone, and we need more resources in place to try to take care of the kids.
Thank you. Specifically on the issue of education, Ashley asked earlier how you feel about initiatives like No Child Left Behind and the Common Core.
Well, I'm a little worried that there's a little too much standardized testing and a little too much top-down curricular planning that's interfering with the ability of teachers to do the best that they can in the classroom. But I also have some humility about that. The governor in our system doesn't set educational policy. That's left to the state board of education and the state school boards and district management. But what you can expect from me is that I'm going to be trying to put the pieces in place to give teachers what they need to succeed and to thrive. And what I'll also do is work with the state legislature so that if mischief comes our way, where somebody's attempting to take all the money out of our public schools and divert them to special interests, I'll be watching that like a hawk, trying to give our kids the best chance they can to succeed. But generally speaking, I want to make sure that teachers get to teach. I'm a teacher, and I don't especially welcome people telling me exactly how to do it. I've got a lot of experience at it, and I'm a pretty good teacher, I'd like to think. So I want to give our teachers a little more flexibility, a little less red tape, a little less bureaucracy.
Thank you. We're going to enter more of the random assortment of questions as I take more from the audience at this point. But the first one I'd like to ask comes from Charlotte, and she asks, what would you do as governor to address the wage gap between men and women?
Yeah, so great question, Charlotte. Utah currently has the largest gender pay gap in America. It's one of our biggest challenges in the state. So a number of things that I'd like to do. First off, I want you to know that I support passage of the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. I'm the only candidate in the race that does. My opponent on the other side doesn't support modifying the Constitution to insist on no discrimination on the basis of sex. But more specifically, in terms of the gender wage gap, I think that at the state level, we should begin with an audit to try to make sure that we're paying our public employees fairly. Second step, I think that we need to do more to facilitate widespread child care and lower cost child care to make sure that moms can go back to work and have the support that they need to improve and grow in their careers. I also would support expanding family and medical leave, because family and medical leave is a critical thing for working moms, also dads, but moms especially. When somebody gets sick or needs to be cared for, too many employers aren't allowing them to take time off to take care of those kids, and so their careers stall and they get left behind. So there's a 3 steps that I support that I think would make a difference. And I'm also going to be open to working with the state legislature in any other way where we can possibly try to make progress on getting that gender wage gap under control.
Thank you. I'm going to bounce to a different question that came in from Ashley, and it relates to the most recent emergency order, executive order that the governor issued. To ask this a little bit more specifically, how do you feel about the governor's emergency powers? Do you feel that they've been used effectively? And how would you use that power if you were governor today to address the coronavirus crisis?
Well, first off, I think that the governor was correct to declare an emergency. The coronavirus, it's sad to me that there are some people out there who seem to have convinced themselves that the coronavirus is a hoax or is not a threat. They are incorrect. Right now, we are approaching nearly 180,000 Americans having died from this dangerous disease. To put that in perspective, that's more Americans that died in the First World War and more Americans that have died in every war, including Korea, Vietnam, and all the Middle Eastern wars since World War II. It is an incredibly dangerous disease. Now, many people get through it and don't really suffer too bad, don't have long-term health effects, but some survive, but also have lung damage, permanent lung damage, heart damage, and even brain damage from this dangerous disease. So it is an emergency, and it expands. It's a very infectious disease because people don't realize that they're passing it on because they can pass on when they're asymptomatic. And so that makes it very, very dangerous. I think the governor was correct to declare an emergency. However, I don't believe that the governor and the lieutenant governor have gone far enough in trying to use those emergency powers to keep us safe and to keep our economy on track. In particular, my biggest point of disagreement is that I would have imposed a statewide mask mandate. About 30 states have passed mask mandates, and most of the other countries in the world who have been successful at containing the virus and have had far fewer casualties, deaths per capita than the United States have had mask mandates. I'll just give you a quick story that I think helps put it in my perspective, get my perspective out there. I remember when I was a little boy, I think it was about 11 years old, 10 years old, when we had an enormous snowfall in Salt Lake and along the Wasatch Front. And the snowpack started to melt in the spring, and it was flooding all of the creeks from all the canyons. And City Creek Canyon, which empties into the valley right on North Temple and State Street, just near Temple Square and the downtown business district where many of our banks and law firms, most important businesses are located, was about to flood, go underwater. But the last Democratic governor of our state, Governor Scott Matheson Sr., and the city mayor and the community came together, and they actually built a river right down State Street under the Eagle Gate Bridge. And they did it with very simple technology. It was sandbags. Sandbags contained a natural disaster because the torrent of water was controlled by them. Right now, we have another natural disaster that's happening in our state, only it's in some ways more dangerous because you can't see it and you don't realize that it's being passed around. A virus is spreading through our communities, and we need to use the equivalent of sandbags, which are masks. They're not perfect. Sandbags can leak, but they generally get the job done. And that's the one area where I think that the governor and the lieutenant governor have fallen down. It's cost effective. It really could have saved many, many lives, hundreds of lives, and it could have brought the virus back under control more quickly. And instead, it's continuing to linger along, hurting our economy, getting more people at risk of infection, interfering with our public school system and our private schools. We've got to get the virus under control. And that's a simple first step that other governors have taken that I would take.
Thank you. The next question also came from Charlotte, and she asked what some of the causes that you personally champion are.
Sure. Well, we mentioned one already. We mentioned a number of them, but I've spent a lot of my career focused on trying to make sure that consumers, that the public are treated fairly in the marketplace. One issue that I think is being overlooked in our state. Did you know that a supermajority of Utahns, both Democrats and Republicans, believe that we should reestablish some sort of limit on the interest rates that are charged by payday loan companies? The average interest rate on payday loans in the state of Utah is over 500%. To put that interest rate in perspective, the loan sharks back in New York City at the height of the power of the organized crime syndicates back there, they only charged about 250% interest rates. Here in Utah, all along State Street and Redwood Road, some out on North Temple, we have companies that are charging terrible interest rates that are putting too many families into a debt trap. And what ends up happening is they just pay interest. It's almost like this family will be put on a hamster wheel where they just keep running as fast as they can, but they can't manage to actually get that debt paid down. And then we've seen studies that show that some of those payday lenders go out and try to get people arrested after they sue them in small claims court. Payday loan companies sue more people in our state than any other type of business by far, and then they go out and get people arrested. Folks don't spend a lot of time in jail, but we have had people spend time in jail, harassed. I think that that's an area where we really need reform. The public wants it. I want it, but the reason it's not happening is because the state legislature is not listening. The governor's office is not listening. Many of them are taking campaign contributions from some of those payday loan companies, and they just don't want to upset the apple cart. I'm willing to fight for ordinary working families. We need to make a change there. We need to make a difference in ordinary people's lives.
Thank you. Another question that just came in, and this is from Jim. It relates to the health of the Great Salt Lake. So a new report came out. He didn't mention the newspaper, saying that the Great Salt Lake would survive, but it requires a lot of love and attention. So as governor, is this something you would prioritize? And if so, how?
Well, it's something I'm willing to look at. I think it's a real challenge. One of our problems in this state is that we're the second driest state in the country. We have a massively growing population. We want to have a diversified economy. One important contributor to our economic development is our agriculture industry, which is still an important industry. And a lot of family farmers and ranchers, and they need water to try to irrigate their crops. We also have growing cities that also need a lot of water. And increasingly, that water is getting diverted away for other uses before it gets to the Great Salt Lake. Add to that, it's not just that we're using too much water, it's also that our climate is changing. And there's less water that's coming in each year. Our snowpacks have been declining, and it's getting hotter and hotter every year, year after year. So I think that the challenges that we're seeing with the Great Salt Lake are very much connected to our overall population and economic growth problem and our challenge and climate change. And of all the things that we haven't talked about yet, climate change is the one that worries me the most. It's the kind of problem that is so big, it's hard to wrap your head around. And I think that Utahns need to do our part to make progress on this. What we've done as a species is gone and found all of the decayed plant matter and mined it all up, and we're burning it and changing the chemical composition of our air. And it's increasing global temperatures. Of course, we still have seasons and winters and summers, but overall temperatures are rising. And here in the Mountain West, we're getting drier and drier. So it's going to be very challenging to make progress on the lake without changing the trajectory of our population growth and climate change. So here are some things that we can do. We need to start focusing on cleaner, renewable energies. We need to decrease the amount of time that we're in cars and airplanes, use telecommuting much more frequently. And also, we need to be better at conserving our water resources. And that also includes making sure that we've got water to keep our riparian landscapes, our rivers and streams and lakes healthy. So balancing all that, that's going to be a real challenge, but that's what I see as the problem. And I would be working with the state agencies, environmental organizations, industry, and other constituencies to make sure that we get the best compromises that we can.
Thank you. The second to last question that I ask all candidates, and you kind of beat me to this, but is there any issue that I didn't raise today that I should have and that you would like to talk about now?
Well, we've done a good job talking about quite a few of them. Maybe one more that I would like to mention. I was very disappointed when in the last legislative cycle, we saw the state legislature do a big tax reform bill. They want to raise some more revenue for programs and things that, many of which are important and I agree with. But the way that they decided to try to do that was by nearly tripling the sales taxes on food. That is completely inconsistent with the direction that I think that we need to go. Back when John Huntsman, the Ambassador Huntsman, former governor, was governor, he championed what was called a flat income tax. And that sounds pretty good. A lot of people, when they just hear about it, think, well, everybody should pay the same amount or the same rate, income tax rate. But what that practically did was dramatically lower taxes on the very most wealthy people who were doing the best in our state and increased income taxes on people who were just barely getting by. And then a few years come by, we realized, well, that doesn't actually balance out. We needed that revenue for our schools, for programs, for people for people with disabilities, to build roads, to invest in things like rural broadband. We need that government revenue. So what do they decide to do? Instead of trying to make those folks who are doing the best, who have a little bit more to give, pay their fair share, they decided to triple the taxes on food, which is literally would have taken 5 cents out of every family's grocery dollar and diverted that away from food to government spending. And that's going to leave low-income kids more hungry, more disadvantaged. I just think that's the exact opposite direction. The public rose up and we're going to pass a ballot measure to stop it. The legislature saw the writing on the wall, changed direction, and decided to get rid of that food tax for now. But next January or the January after that, should be feel pretty confident that there's going to be a new push to try to find new ways to make low income and moderate income people pay an unfair share of taxes. Right now in the state of Utah, the richest people pay the lowest percent of their overall wealth and income on taxes, and people who are, not living on the street, but people who are working those 1 or 2 or 3 jobs and just barely making ends meet pay a larger portion of their income in taxes. That's inconsistent with my core views. And it's not because I'm some, wild-eyed liberal professor or something. It's in the Bible. The Bible says, to whom much is given, a little more should be expected. That's my core value. I'll be fighting for those folks to make sure that they aren't forced to bear a disproportionate share of the taxes.
Thank you. The last, as we close out the hour, I want to make sure that we end at 5 o'clock. The last question that I'd ask you is, how can folks get involved in your campaign? How can they learn more about you? And then just your closing statement.
Well, thank you so much, Turner. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, but you can also learn more about our campaign by going to our website, petersonforutah, all one word.com. And if you want to get involved in our campaign, we'd love to have your help. If you believe in what you're hearing here, we need volunteers. If you want a lawn sign, just let us know and we'll get one out to you. And we have a bunch of events at different areas throughout the valley and the state where we're handing out lawn signs. And I'd also like to say we need your help financially. On the other side, my opponent has big businesses that are contributing vast amounts to his campaign that are going to allow him to buy a lot of TV ads, and we need support too if we're gonna get our message out there. So if you're willing and if you can afford it, I encourage you to make a contribution on our website. Thank you for the opportunity. I really do hope that you like what you hear. I'm in this race for the right reasons. I'm in this race because I want to represent and listen to ordinary working Utahns, people that are too often left behind, forced to pay a disproportionate share of the taxes, exposed to scams and frauds and abuses, and maybe aren't getting paid a fair or a living wage at the jobs that they're working. And maybe too many of them don't even have a job and are facing eviction and foreclosure. I'm worried about our land, our public lands, our natural resources and environmental stewardship, and what our world's going to look like, not just for this generation, but for our kids and the kids that are coming up after them. And when we as a state have risen up in recent years and managed to make progress on some of these key issues, whether that's expanding Medicaid or allowing people who are suffering from a disease to have prescription, doctor prescribed marijuana, or fair legislative districts that are not gerrymandered so all of the lower income people are packed into one district and don't get as much of a fair say in the state legislature. Utahns, to their credit, passed laws trying to challenge all of those things, only to have the state legislature walk them back, water them down, and the governor's office give that watered down version his stamp of approval. I won't do that. I'm going to listen to ordinary working Utahns. I'm going to fight for you and try to give this state a better government, a more fair government, a government for all Utahns. Thanks for listening. I hope I have your vote and I hope I have your support.
Thank you so much, Chris. And we'll be sure, as I said at the beginning, this is being recorded. For those who are watching live, we'll post the recording later this evening. Thank you so much, Chris, and good luck.
Thank you, Turner. It's great to be here with you today. And thank you to all my friends and neighbors out on the West Side. I care about you and I'm fighting for you.